All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. You can just take your seats. Thank you for joining Track 3, the Drug Development Pathway, sponsored by PRA Health Sciences. I am Cassandra, and I will be your room host for this last breakout session today. As a reminder, this track is being live streamed, and I would like to welcome our remote attendees and remind everyone to utilize that mobile app for the question and answer session throughout today's talk. Our last breakout session will be presented by Walt, Director of Strategy and Operations at Fulcrum Therapeutics. He will be leading our session today on patients as investors. Please join me in welcoming Walt.
Thank you. Works. So thank you, everyone. I know we're already after the closing remarks, and yet we're still here. So thank you for sticking around. Thank you to PRA for sponsoring. Thank you to Nicole, Global Genes, for putting this on. Thank you. So I want to talk today about two things. I believe both of these to be true, and I want to find a way for us to work together and fix that. I believe there are far too few medicines for patients with rare genetic diseases. And I believe the people in this room have the power, have the ability to change this. Where am I coming from, though? So I'll just give you context for this. First and foremost, I'm the father of two wonderful kids. Occasionally, they let me sleep. This is Caroline and Harrison. And yes, Harrison does have his hand in a giraffe's mouth. So you may question my judgment on this. I'm a proud father, first and foremost, where I'm coming from here. Second, I bring experience in biotech, venture capital, business consulting, and I have a PhD in chemical biology from Harvard. Together, these pieces have given me the opportunity to build a company, Fulcrum Therapeutics. And I believe a lot of the things that it took to build that company are things that people in this room can stand up and make happen. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. These 2 points that I mentioned earlier do serve as a bit of a roadmap for what we'll talk about today. I'm going to start by going through a little bit of what I believe our biomedical, our pharma ecosystem looks like today. That does serve as a little bit of a diagnostic for why there are far too few medicines. And then we're going to dig into the second part of this, is how we can start to change this. Despite this just incredibly unprecedented advances in biomedical research, we still see pharma as being fairly downstream. Pharmaceutical companies continue to focus on clinical stage molecules, clinical stage drugs. And that's wonderful. They can bring the scale and the infrastructure to run clinical trials, to do manufacturing, but it still leaves this massive gap. Where are those molecules? Where are those medicines coming from before they go into clinical trials? I think we're seeing more and more of the investor community focusing on even later, closer to clinical studies now. What that leaves is this gap. It leaves this gap in between basic funding, predominantly by government agencies, NIH, I'm sure most of us are familiar with, and then pharma on the other end, who have the scale and the infrastructure to actually push these medicines through clinical study and development. This track is largely about getting medicines to the clinic. I'm going to focus on that space, filling this blue arrow here. How do we fill this gap? The title of the session is Patients as Investors, but I believe it's more than that. I think the patients need to also be the catalyst. They can make a lot of this happen. It's not just purely financial. It's investment of time, it's investment of your networks, it's the investment of the infrastructure you've established. And I think there's incredible news. This is something that a lot of people, when I talk about this, a lot of people find surprising. In this country, in the United States, every year there's about $100 billion spent on biomedical research. 4% of that comes from philanthropy, largely patient groups. Some of them are the big behemoths, Michael J. Fox, CFF, but a lot of it's also just smaller groups with less money, but still it adds up to 4%. And we just said that pharma and biotech stays downstream in the clinical study. So if you take that 4% and you look at it in the context of 52% being largely clinical trials and downstream, that 4% actually becomes a pretty big piece of where new molecules, new medicines can come from. The foundation laid by philanthropy, by patient groups is astonishing. It's enabling all these innovations and advances. And what's incumbent upon us all then is to make those become drugs, make those become medicines. We'll come back to these 4 examples in a minute, but we are starting to see this so much more, and it takes different flavors each time. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has been doing this for a long time. They're certainly one of the poster childs of this. But there are other organizations, and I'll come back to these in a minute. So how do we make this happen? A lot of the patient groups that I talk to have built incredible scientific and medical networks. They're also the experts in the disease. They know what's going on with patients way better than any clinician, way better than any scientist. They are the ones who can start to define the value. What is it that a new medicine can do? How does it change a life? They're also the ones who have passion and drive more than anyone else to actually make a difference. Patient groups can stand up and be the catalyst to make all this happen. First and foremost, it needs to start with a strategy. Talk to people. It's clear that a lot of organizations get tied up in putting out fires, often as a second job for a lot of people, and they start funding research, but it's not necessarily in the context of an overarching strategy and how to drive towards new medicines that pharma would pick up and then study in the clinic. What I'd say every group should start with as they think about catalyzing and investing is start with a strategy. How is it that biomedical advances can be brought to bear against a given disease? The great news is that most groups have fantastic clinicians and fantastic scientists that can help them. But start asking questions. Is a gene therapy even appropriate for our disease, our indication? Maybe a small molecule, a pill is a better approach. Also, along the way, we'll start identifying people to talk to. Who are going to be the people that help this? Often we find that academic scientists and clinicians are very excited and very willing to offer their time. But we need more than that to get drugs developed. We need drug discovery. We need finance experts. And that brings you to the last piece. How do you pay for all this? Come back to this more specifically in a minute. But one way to map this out is to think about all the different milestones and how you can fund in a very rational and stepwise way. So I'd recommend 2 things. Support any serious effort you can. There are a lot of great companies out there doing a lot of great work. And sometimes they have opportunities to make a difference in a disease that they're, for one reason or another, not doing yet. Talk to those companies, understand what the limitations are, and do everything you can. If it's purely financial, that can maybe put you down more of an investor track. But a lot of times, it's things like natural history studies, patient registries, things like that patient groups have absolutely been in the middle of for a long time. And then if in the context of a strategy, nobody is working on what should be worked on, that's where you have this incredible opportunity to step up and make it happen. Covered a lot of this just a minute ago, but when you do find those companies, understand their operations, understand ways to enhance it. Certainly, platform companies are an area to understand as well. Gene therapy companies, CRISPR companies, companies that have these next generation technologies that may not be brought to bear yet in the indication, in the disease that affects your constituency. So let's talk about some of those examples I mentioned earlier. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, certainly a patient group that's been on the forefront of venture philanthropy and really enabling pharma. Went too far. Oh, it's the wrong slide deck. There we go. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. This all started years ago when a company in San Diego, a small company in San Diego, Aurora Biosciences, had an interesting way of studying ion channels. CFF, in the context of an overarching strategy on what it was going to take to finally make a breakthrough difference in cystic fibrosis, saw that this ion channel insight had the opportunity to do that. So they got involved. They started working with Aurora, found a way to get Aurora to work on cystic fibrosis, an area where there was a technology, the ion channel technology, that could be used but wasn't. Cystic fibrosis stepped in and made that happen. And probably many of us are now familiar with what subsequent acquisitions and now Vertex has brought to bear for the cystic fibrosis community. Amicus has, not too long ago, bought a molecule from a company called Miomed. Miomed was actually started by two parents who got to know an academic in Italy who had an interesting idea for how to treat CDKL5 deficiency. Those two parents realized that that academic wasn't going to be able to do it himself. They licensed the technology from the university. They built a very small corporation, never actually even had a full-time employee. And with that, we're able to do a couple of key experiments, and it led to Amicus picking that up, and now it's part of Amicus's pipeline. Not too dissimilar, Avexis recently started a partnership with the Rett Syndrome Research Trust. Another example where in the context of a roadmap, overarching strategy of what it would take to really make a difference in Rett syndrome, the RSRT had an ongoing multi-year effort in gene therapy. Eventually, they got to the point where they realized they were going to need a real industrial partner on this, the scale, the manufacturing, all of this infrastructure it takes. They ultimately took all of the work they'd been funding for a while and are now partnering with Avexis on it. It's a great story of how patients and patient groups can really step up, pull together a number of different academics, start advancing the field, and then make it ripe, make it perfect for an industrial entity to pick up and start working with. And even at the very beginning of this journey now, the Silverstein Foundation was announced only a few months ago. And this is a group of individuals who are affected with a monogenic, a specific subtype of Parkinson's disease. In the context of their strategy, they realized there were just massive gaps in the understanding of basic science around their specific form of Parkinson's. When you look at what they're working on today, they're focused on the very early pieces of this, of filling those gaps. They haven't even started drug discovery yet because they realize they can't until some of this basic understanding is put in place. But each one of these are examples of where a group of patients, a group of individuals were able to work together, take pieces in academia, fill holes in what's understood about the basic science, or find a company that could be doing something but didn't. And it's because the patients stood up and did it that it got done. And you know, with the case of CF, you look at that and just so happy to see those drugs, and you certainly hope that the other organizations get there too. Forgive my slides. So as you think about potentially looking at any company who you may want to work with, three main areas to be looking at. First and foremost, the science. And certainly as you think about a context of a strategy that you're going to look at, you want to make sure you understand the limitations of the different technologies you may consider. You want to look at what a given company, what a given approach is, how it is attacking the underlying etiology of the disease. Fantastic place to be working with your network. Be working with the academics, be working with the clinical experts that you already know. But you then need to complement that and augment that with people who've been in drug discovery, understand how it is that drugs get made. Often academics start to, well, I guess often, most of the time academics don't have that expertise. And so that's one place where you can see an opportunity to start building a network. And then of course, capital. How is it that a project, an effort that could become a drug gets funded over time? But when you look at these three ingredients, you can really start to understand where a company might need your help or what companies are already off to the races. But of course, not every indication, and unfortunately not every indication we may ultimately want to work on has a company, has an ongoing effort. And that's where it can become, in my case, very exciting. That's where you can bring in the entrepreneurial spirit and really make something happen that isn't otherwise happening. This is what we did with Fulcrum Therapeutics. I've been working on this company for about 3 years, and it very much started on a whiteboard. I'm going to tell you a little bit of that story as an example of how we can think about the science, how we can think about the medicine, the people, and how you bring a team together that can pull all of these different expertise together, the capabilities together. And then funding. How do we think about funding a company over time? As you think about your indications, as you think about your diseases, what's known? Is there even enough known to know whether a replacement or gene editing strategy makes sense? Or do we need to focus more on small molecules? Is it a central, is it a CNS disease? Is it a liver disease? Is it clear genetic etiology? What is really known and what does that mean for the science? This is all part of your strategy that you can develop. What is known about the models? There will be no perfect model of any given disease. In some cases, mice are good. Some cases, mice, you can just throw them out the window. Of course, you want to study toxicology and understand anything safe before putting it in a human. But in a lot of diseases, and this is certainly the way we work on it at Fulcrum, we focus on stem cell models. We focus on the cellular models of the disease. And then biomarkers. Everyone likes to talk about biomarkers. You certainly want to understand if you are actually intervening in the molecular pathways and the biochemistry that you think you are as you enter the clinical studies. Fragile X started because we wanted to make a difference. Fulcrum started because we wanted to make a difference in Fragile X. I think as most people know in our community, our rare disease community, gene therapy's been pretty exciting the last few years. We've seen incredible advances. The Spark Therapeutics data is just blow away incredible. And there have been a number of companies started in this space. But one of the amazing things about Fragile X syndrome is that the gene is already there. We don't actually have to do gene therapy because the mutation that gives rise to Fragile X is in the regulatory element. The gene is there, it just gets turned off because of a mutation. So we started Fulcrum because we wanted to be able to turn on genes in the context where the mutation has turned off a gene. So Fragile X syndrome became our lead indication, our lead program. And as we started down this path, started asking questions, started to understand the science, it became clear that we were going to need to establish disciplines, scientific expertise in 4 disciplines. Genetics, and how that genetics teaches us about the disease. Gene regulation, how is it these genes are turned on and off? Cell biology, how is it that we can think about modeling these diseases? Modeling human behavior in mice has been an abject failure. And it shouldn't surprise us. Mice are pretty far away from humans in so many ways. But we can look at the electrical properties of stem cells converted into neurons in a dish, and that can teach us about the underlying pathways in Fragile X. And then lastly, how do we actually pull that all together through screening and computational techniques? It was about 200 experts in science and in medicine and that we talked to really help us understand these disciplines that needed to be brought together. And it was through those discussions that we ended up getting, what I like to say, get the right people on the bus. Who really bought into what we were doing scientifically? Who really thought medically we could make a difference? Helped craft our strategy, refine our strategy, helped us identify the people we wanted involved. And what that led to was a handful of scientific founders. So these are all academics who really thought that we could do what we wanted to do. And they started spending a significant amount of time designing our science, putting the plans in place, helping us recruit a team of full-time employees, and really booting up the programs, if you will, booting up the projects that are going to give rise to the medicines we seek. And it was through the scientific diligence that we found these people. But of course, the scientific founders themselves are not enough, and this comes back to thinking about a people strategy. Over time, lots and lots of expertise is needed. Who else is going to be in this with you? So we had the scientific founders who really thought that the molecular biology and the cell biology made sense. But then we started complementing that. The world's experts in gene regulation are not also the world's experts in Fragile X syndrome. So we built a scientific advisory board of people who really understand those diseases. And then we built an advisory board of clinicians who can help us get these medicines into the clinicians' hands and study how they work. And then, of course, we started building a team. Fulcrum is now 40 people big, and we're working on diseases. And those are all experts, all people with expertise in the different domains of biology, drug discovery, chemistry, translational medicine. The real industrial expertise, the really industrial disciplines needed to make drugs, different than the underlying molecular biology. And then lastly, we've continued to build our board of directors focused on the strategic and financial and industry experience. Which brings to the third piece, capital. So how do we think about funding these programs over time? Fulcrum started as early as it possibly could. We had no underlying IP. We started with a dream and some cells in a dish. And yet we were able to put together a financial plan that attracted a significant amount of capital. Milestone-based, really driven by key understanding of what will be valuable. This comes back to the patients. The patients know what will be valuable. Help the investors understand what will be life-changing and how that can then work backwards in the drug discovery process, and you can work from those valuable pieces from day one. So in Fragile X, we can all get excited about turning the gene on, but I don't know that turning a gene on is necessarily going to get patients and families excited. But if we can convert that into electrical firing and change central phenotypes, that'll make a big difference. So how can we start thinking about that even day one? How can we convince people that we're going to make that difference even when we're still in the cellular setting? And that's when you think about milestones, really start to build as early as you can some of those really valuable points. And back to the patients. The patients know where the value is. You guys know better than anyone else what will change the lives. But also be mindful that it's science and it's unpredictable. You can't run it so lean that you don't give yourself the flexibility. There will be mistakes, there will be setbacks. We understand so little about biology in the grand scheme of things that you have to anticipate there being setbacks. Often you get the question of, all right, so how much does this cost? And certainly there's been plenty of press over the last few weeks even on debates on how much it costs to make a drug. One of the reasons that it's so hotly debated is because there's no one great authoritative study. This is one figure that lays out some pretty reasonable numbers. So this comes from an article a few years ago in Nature Reviews Drugs Discovery. Across the top, you see a standard stepwise drug discovery and development pipeline. In the brown color, the early preclinical work, all the way up to then the blue where a clinical study begins. A lot of cases here, we're talking about getting from academic insights about biology, to a clinical trial. And so what I've highlighted here in the third row down, cost per phase. And this is just cash outlay. But what you can see here, 1 million, 2.5, you add it up, we can argue about whether these numbers are right or wrong, but they're certainly within an order of magnitude. So $20 million. That seems like a lot of money. I certainly don't have $20 million. But it is within the realm of what people can raise. And it's certainly within the realm of the right milestone-based strategy, the compelling value proposition of how you're going to change lives, you can get investors excited. And so as you start mapping this out, as you start thinking about what a strategy would be and how we can move forward, scale. At Fulcrum, we've built a pipeline for multiple diseases. That may not be right for every group. You may team up with other indications, or you may say there's closely related disorder and team up, and then you build a bigger pipeline. But think about the scale and the intensity of the effort. What are the milestones, and how do you think about risk? Certainly, this is very risky. Can we even model Fragile X in a dish with cell models, with cell lines? What are those really early validation points you need to establish, and how will that convince investors? How do you discharge that over time? And then as we talked about, what's going to be meaningful? It is exciting to see our cell lines, our Fragile X cell lines, get normal physiology, normal electrical properties that are very much related to what's going on to a Fragile X patient's head. To see that has really been one of these pieces that convinces investors we know what we're doing, allows us to continue raising that money. So back to what we just said, roughly $20 million. You don't have to raise that all on day one. Put the milestones in place, put the seed money in place, and take steps at it. Take bite-sized pieces of it. One of the incredible things about biotech, and one of the things I just love about working in this space, is that it is a space where almost everyone's incentives can be aligned. If we make a big difference in patients' lives, there'll be plenty of financial returns for everyone involved. I joke with my family that this is very different than McDonald's, right? McDonald's gets happy if they make everyone fat and they sell more burgers, right? Sort of the antithesis of healthcare in some ways. We get to change lives. We get to help make people's lives better. That value proposition, that is exciting. There's no shortage of capital out there with a right plan, grounded in good science, with good people around the table. The people in this room can put these pieces together. And then one piece that I think is often missed, but is absolutely important to be thinking about from the earliest moments. What's the exit? What's the end game plan here? If you're really trying to get the molecule to clinical study and then hand it off, know that on day one. It's going to take massive scale to do clinical trials, commercial organizations, supply chains, regulatory. It might make sense to build that all within an entity that you're starting to create or put together. But much like some of the examples I mentioned, it may also make sense to hand that off. If you do hand it off, start building those relationships very, very early on. Start to have a plan for how you're going to ultimately exit, how you're ultimately going to get your program, your putative medicine across the goal line into patients. So I started by saying that there are far too few medicines for patients with rare genetic diseases. And what I like to think and what I try to convince lots of people I talk to is that everyone in this room has the ability. You have the network. You have the willingness and the passion that's completely unrivaled to go out and talk to the experts and understand where the real gaps in understanding are. And if it makes sense, start directing your scientific budget, your research budget towards those gaps. When the moment is right, when through your network, through the other experts you can bring to bear, start to identify opportunities for drug discovery, that's where you can get creative. Maybe it's like Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. You identify a company who's got an interesting technology that may work. Or no one's doing it, and you have to step up and do it yourself, like some of the examples I showed earlier. But the people in this room have the ability, they have the networks, and in a lot of cases, have the ability to raise the money needed. The first step on that chart was $1 million. With the ability to raise money, $1 million can be raised fairly easily with the right plan and the right people around the table. Resources, where can you go for help? Global Genes, incredible network. Love what Nicole's done here, put together an incredible set of people who can help, and I think what's even more incredible about the Global Genes network is when you get into the second and third degrees there, such an incredible set of experts you can tap into. The other piece, I'm actually working with a set of folks to put together a workshop that can take a few steps deeper on this path. An entrepreneurship workshop, November 15. It'll be hosted by Ultragenyx up in the Bay Area of California. You can apply. We have an application online. Actually, should have put the website here. But we can make sure that everyone gets the information. With that, I thank everyone for their time. I would love to take any questions if people have questions.
So there are two ways you can submit questions. You can come right up to one of the mics, or you can feed them via the app. So at this time, please feel free to come on up.
Hi, Walt.
Hi, Nicole.
This is Nicole. I just wanted to make a comment, and I was very excited about Walt providing an opportunity to have you all hear what he's doing. I think as we grow as advocates and here at the Global Genes Summit, as you kind of move down this continuum of all these things in rare disease, we're all naturally moving towards trying to become more active in being a participant in developing these drugs. And with that comes a certain level of expertise and organizational expertise. And Walt is an amazing resource for that. So I'm not gonna, he'll be inundated, but Walt's amazing. And I think that all of us here and everyone who's listening has a real opportunity to learn from Walt. If you can participate in the program that they're doing, it's going to really help people as you kind of develop and try to model an organization from how do you build your scientific advisory board and what's a conflict and what isn't, and how do you move forward in a responsible way that's going to help you build that base so you can go and be a participant and a driver in finding that treatment or that cure. So I just want to thank you, Walt, because
Thank you,
what you're doing is incredible, incredibly important to all of us here, and just grateful that you were here. And I'm also going to give a shout out to Betsy Bogard, who is, I know, a partner in crime here. So thanks, and please, everyone, take advantage of this opportunity with Walt.
Thank you, Nicole. And I think that was more effusive than even my parents would be. So.
All right, come on, guys, don't be shy.
I can start asking questions.
Hi, Eric Hartman with the Choroideremia Research Foundation. One of the things you talked about in the formation for smaller foundations, when you talk about the amount of capital necessary to get these through preclinical or into the beginning of phase 1 trials. One of the things that we've worked, and I know a number of others have, is if we make a sizable investment in the preclinical work for a trial of potentially becoming a minority owner or at some point just a partnership agreement where there are milestone payments that would go back to the foundation. If, say, the product makes it through
Sure.
gene therapy trial and then finally gets approval. What it does, at least for foundations like mine, is it means if we can get a gene therapy in through trial, we can then begin with that reinvestment
Absolutely.
to go to, say, site replacement therapy.
And I think there are some great examples of how that has happened. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation be one, more recently Cure Duchenne. So I think that's absolutely the way to be thinking about it. I think the key thing to do in your case is from the very outset, with everyone you talk to, set the expectation that the foundation is going to fund this, but they're also going to participate. Make sure you have a seat at the table, not only from a financial return standpoint, so you can create a self-sustaining entity, but also so you can influence how the project moves forward. And whether that's through a position on the cap table, board of directors, or royalties, sub-licensing, there's lots of ways to structure it. But I think the key thing is to make sure, back to the strategy piece, have a plan at the very beginning, set the expectation that the organization will be participating. And I think what you'll find is that most people will be pretty receptive to that. And there absolutely and probably should always be some back and forth in negotiation of exactly how big and what pie slices get cut up which way. But if you set the expectation right away and you're putting your capital in, you shouldn't work with anyone who won't ensure that you get your downstream rewards.
Right. Thank you.
Hi, Walter. Thanks for that presentation. I'm Tracy Van Houten with the Noah's Hope Bat Disease Research Fund. I have a question. So in the different forms of bat disease, we have different patient populations.
Sure.
So can you talk to me how investors think about the value proposition in disease groups of, let's say, sub 100 versus groups of, say, 1,500? And how do we drive that value in a smaller patient population, even if our preclinical work looks much better versus a smaller effect in a much larger population that perhaps looks more attractive on the outside to investors?
Yeah, I think that's a common question, is particularly in our world where gene sequencing has identified so many very, very rare, ultra rare diseases, right? I think what you find is that different entities, whether it's investors, whether it's pharma, have very different thresholds on what a viable return would be. I think one thing I would keep in mind, though, is that the riskiest dollars that go in are at the very beginning. And if the organization is putting up part of the capital, you can really start to bend that ROI curve. You can really start to bend the economics for the entity that picks it up. One way to think about solving this problem, or at least starting to solve the problem on treating the long tail of so many genetic diseases, is by having the patient groups actually put up some of that riskiest capital. A lot of what we talked about here, that first $1 million in is going to be the riskiest money that ever goes in. As an investor, I look at that and I might say, well, I have some threshold about number of patients and timelines and all that, but all of a sudden, if I'm able to participate at a less risky time, that shifts the curve a little bit. So I think if you really want to get into the financials of it, there are lots of ways to really reframe that problem you mentioned for a lot of these different entities. I think then you come to the other question which you mentioned, is how do you think about really big changes in small populations versus small changes in big populations? Me personally, and this is my viewpoint, I think we're headed towards a reimbursement era where the only thing that gets any reasonable pricing and payment is going to be big changes, right? And so I think what you're going to start to see is the slow evolution of people realizing this, of pharma companies, investors realizing this, and hopefully we'll start focusing more and more on the opportunities to make that big difference. That's my viewpoint, though.
We've got a couple questions coming in from the app. So here's the first one. Can you talk a little bit about venture that's always a word I struggle with, philanthropy, and how it is different or similar than what you described in your talk as building a company?
Great question. Thank you for wherever that came from. I think venture philanthropy is just one of the tools in the toolkit of the company creation that we talked about. Venture philanthropy in the purest play ends up looking like just pure investment dollars. Put some money in, hope for a financial return. I think what we're seeing, though, is that patients have already inserted themselves into the center of these communities and have the ability to participate as more than just financial investors, right? So if you want to think about venture philanthropy as putting money to work in some other organization, another way to think about it is, well, taking those dollars and building the organization yourself.
Okay, great.
We have 2 questions right here.
Yeah, so normally biotech type companies, you started off and you're advocating for patients to invest their own time and their own money, which is great. Fully support that. At what point do you consider, as you go along the process of building this company, where you would pivot or quit?
Or quit.
Yeah, correct.
I think that's actually one of the hardest decisions any company ever faces. And we go through this all the time at Fulcrum, where we look at a new program or a new project we could start. What are those very clear milestones, right? I don't think I have any kind of magic answer. It's a really hard question. I think you do have to, as part of your initial strategy, start to set some goals, right? So I'll give you an example. In Fragile X syndrome, I mentioned we're trying to turn a gene on, right? So we'd love to get to a clinical trial and actually help patients, but we can say early on, if we don't turn that gene on enough, and then we can get an argument about what enough means. But if we set an early milestone, turn that gene on. If we can't do that, we should probably cut bait and go figure out why we can't do that and come back, right? So I think the key is to set some of those early milestones tied to the project and then stay disciplined to them. And I think those milestones have to be very specific for whatever disease and whatever project, whatever value you're trying to do there.
Hi, my name is Julia Vitarello. I'm from Mila's Miracle Foundation. My daughter has Batten disease as well, but a different type.
And was this Timothy yesterday over at the Investor Forum?
Yes.
It's an
if you saw
incredible
that, yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Incredible story.
I actually, prior to meeting Timothy, I started funding work towards a gene therapy trial. So we actually have 2 different trials that we are working on.
Congratulations.
So, thanks. This is my first time at this conference, and I've been overwhelmed at how many people, especially families, are contributing, obviously, to major breakthroughs, especially in gene therapy. As an investor, if I'm approaching an investor, obviously, if they do a little bit of homework, they're going to see how many different foundations there are out there that are all doing wonderful things and contributing to, let's say, to gene therapy. How do I, it's always a little bit strange because I don't want to be competing, I guess that's the nature of the game, but, with other foundations that are also, seeking funds for very similar trials.
Sure.
I guess the question is, how do I stand out? I'd like to tell an investor that I feel like it's more than, this is more than my daughter Mila, it's more than Batten disease, that I'm contributing to something bigger. But if they do homework and they see that there are many other foundations doing something similar, what is a good argument, let's say, to get their attention?
Yeah, and I think raising money is it's like the fairy tale. You have to kiss a lot of frogs. So that's the downside. I think the truth of it is, anytime you're raising money, you have to know your audience, right? There'll be some audiences where you can really tug on the heartstrings. There'll be other audiences where they just want to know very clearly, what stage are you at? What are the milestones? How much do you need, right? And then take lots of shots. I think from a differentiation perspective and how you think about the other groups, lay out the landscape a priori. This is the world of gene therapy. This is the world in Batten disease. Here's how we try to make a difference. And it's not disparaging anyone else. Everyone has great intentions. But here's how we fit into that. And here's why we think we're doing something unique. And you want to work with those people who get that, right? And if it takes 100 meetings to find 5, that's actually a decent yield.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we've got a few more coming in via the app. So $1 million can seem overwhelming. Can you walk through the stakeholders, both internal and external, to get the process moving forward to achieve funding?
Sure. I think there it depends a lot on who you're trying to get the money from. At most organizations, you can ultimately decide, you can decipher who the decision maker is. If it's a venture capital firm, they're going to have their decision-making process. And ask. Just ask. It's very reasonable to ask in any meeting, what is the decision-making process? What committees are involved? That'll then naturally lead to a discussion on timeline. So whether it's a family office, a philanthropic organization, the government, if you think about some of the agencies that give out grants, ask. Understand their process, understand their decision makers. It even ties back to your question about what will be the right approach for those folks.
Great. Here's another one. $1 million investment early in discovery is high risk. How does a patient group decide whether to take that risk or instead to invest that money in central infrastructure that supports established drug development efforts?
That's a fantastic question, and I think one that probably every organization will struggle with. I have my viewpoint, and it's probably because it's probably sort of a little bit of a biased one because I do work in therapeutics, I do work in biotech. But if you don't have those programs, those early shots on goal, the infrastructure is not going to matter. Now, it is a chicken and egg thing, of course, because if you don't have the infrastructure and that's not there, how do you even entice people? So I get that. But my perspective is that if you're starting completely blank slate, start taking those shots on goal so that you have a potential medicine moving forward that can use the infrastructure. If there are opportunities out there, if there are companies working on it, of course, then start putting the infrastructure in place back to the point of supporting those who are already doing good work.
Right.
This is Nicole. I have a comment. So I'm going to use Deborah Miller from Cure Duchenne because you brought it up earlier. I'll never forget 5 years ago, she said that there was one thing that she did that was a total game changer for her organization. She invested in a chief scientific officer that was not tied to Duchenne in any way. So he became kind of this general contractor for her. He evaluated all the different opportunities because she did not know. She, to this day, says, I wish I would have done that from day one. So my question for you, Walt, a lot of what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but it's still super scary because it sounds logical, but for a lot of, all the patient advocates in there, it's not, the process isn't so clear, from
Absolutely.
bake sales to, like early stage investment. I mean, what does that all mean and when? So my question for you is, at what point should our family foundations think about investing in some expertise, whether it's consultants or someone that can help as you start moving down this path to help you make the right decisions and to help make it not so overwhelming so that you're not wasting time and money?
Great question, Nicole. And I go back to building a strategy. Day one, there are, one of the great things about the recent run-up in biotech stocks is that it's given a lot of people the opportunity to leave their jobs. So through some networking, you can find people who have left their jobs and are willing to do consulting work. They can jump in and give you 50 hours. In 50 hours, someone who really understands drug discovery and has done it before can sit down with the organization, can sit down with the academic experts, clinicians, and scientists, and really start to build that strategy. So then, Nicole, your great point was it does seem scary. Now I say, wow, living with some of these diseases seems scary. The investing thing seems easy. But in the context of a strategy and a plan, clear milestones and taking bite-sized chunks of it, it can start to seem a lot less daunting. So I'd agree with Deborah's advice, and I'd say in spades, day one, build that strategy and get some of that expertise around the table. And the way you're going to find that is through your networks.
There's still time, so anybody else?
Jane Gunther from Cure Catskill. You mentioned licensing as a strategy.
Absolutely.
Can you give an idea of what that cost is? I know it's going to range, right?
It's a massive range. I think you can look at some licenses where it's essentially no money up front, and maybe there's some back-end payments, if it becomes successful, the university shares in that. And then you have the complete other end of the spectrum where you start talking about once-in-a-decade technologies like CRISPR and gene editing, right? The licensing there can be quite a bit more than nothing. So I think it's just a massive range is the fairest thing I'd say.
And do you need a lawyer to help you with that?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. A lot of lawyers, a lot of lawyers will work for essentially free, deferring all of their fees until some later point. So, again, you can negotiate that a bit too.
Betsy Bogard, do you have any advice as a patient advocate and someone who's been involved in drug development? You're putting a lot of great process in place. What advice could you give to all these folks here?
Do you know that I hate cold calls? I don't know. I think Walt hit it all.
Speechless.
Yeah. I think both for the IFOPA and for some work I've done for another rare disease community, what was really helpful was just talking to people. So I spent a lot of time just going to and talking to people to understand, because I'm not a scientist, so I needed to know what the scientists see and think. And so I went and talked to a lot of people in the field. And what was really important was to talk not just to the academic experts, but to go and talk to the people who work in drug development and to just go find companies that may be relevant and not be afraid to just contact them, call them, email them, and say, I'd love to talk to you about this disease. I'd love to hear your perspective on the drug development landscape around this disease. What do you think that we as a patient organization can be doing to help get a therapy? And the feedback and the direction and guidance that we got was what made our strategy. So I just, for me, talking to the people who are out there who have the expertise is invaluable. And people who work in industry, the good people, are really happy to hear from you and to hear from a patient group and to offer their expertise and to help point you in the right direction. So.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rhonda Connolly, and hi, Walter, and hi,
Rhonda.
Betsy. And I'm with the PKU community that benefited from these two. And actually, it was through Global Genes last year that I was introduced to Walt and Betsy. And sitting down with Walt in January and talking to him about where our organization should go, he gave us the direction about creating this strategic plan. And we said, how do we do that? Who do we talk to? And somehow Betsy's name came up. And so Betsy helped us as an organization create our strategic plan, our roadmap, if you are. And we are now using that to take us to the next step and the next level. And again, it was through Global Genes that we have come this far. So thank you both, and Global Genes.
And did it make it less daunting, to Nicole's point? No. Did it make it less daunting than to take the next steps by having the strategy and all that context?
Yes. No, it's definitely helped us in our organization and the direction that we're going and spending our money that we have been raising and our resources. Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Great. We do have one question. So how can investigators be helpful in raising money? Whose practices will benefit from the availability of a new therapy?
I think that's two questions. So whose practices, I assume that means clinicians, right?
Yes.
So the first one, investigators, I think one thing that happens is they can actually be, as we were talking about, the actual scientific or clinical experts. Anytime an investor, anyone who's doing diligence is going to try to find experts who can help understand the science, understand whether an approach makes sense or not. So they can make themselves available. They can show up to meetings when it makes sense. But they can really be there, lend their credibility, and also help explain and put things in context. And then on practice, I think I'm just going to defer that one. I mean, the way economics are divided up in our country with medicine is a mess, right?
That's fair. Any other questions? All right. Well, please join me in thanking Walt for his time today and sharing his expertise.
Thank you.
So this does conclude this afternoon's breakout sessions, but before we head out, if you can jump onto the mobile app and take our brief survey on this session, we would also like to invite you back here at 5:30 for a pre-reception sponsored by Vertex, followed by the Rare Champion of Hope Awards and reception. And one last note, within the agenda, you'll notice after lunch on the app, please be sure to take the Patient Advocate Needs Survey. Thank you very much.